Is positive conflict a contradiction? Hi, I'm Greg Feeney, Communication Faculty Member at Bluegrass Community and Technical College. Welcome to today's Key Concepts lecture on conflict styles and functional versus dysfunctional conflict. During this brief presentation, I will review various conflict styles, which style is best to use, as well as what allows for functional conflict. The first thing I'm going to address today is conflict styles. And as you can see from the accompanying PowerPoint presentation, there are 5 different ones that I'm going to address today. The first one is non-assertive. What we mean by non-assertive is somebody who basically ignores conflict or shows no reaction to it. They keep everything internalized. And they view this rather than engaging in conflict. They may have a fear of making it worse. They may not see it worth it. But this person is not going to be assertive. They're not going to bring the conflict up. The next one, which is making a little step forward, is indirect. A person who reacts in an indirect manner or uses this style they're still not going to address it specifically. They're not going to name it for what it is. They're not going to engage in much aggressive behavior, but what they are going to do is drop hints. So they may hint that something is wrong to try to give the person a clue and hope that everything is taken care of through those hints. The next one is probably the one that bothers me the most when I see other individuals, and that is passive aggressiveness. And this is where individuals express dissatisfaction in a disguised manner. So you may tell me to do the dishes, and I don't want to do the dishes because I feel like you should do the dishes. And rather than say that, I may agree to it, be like, fine, but then I don't do them. And then when you bring it up later, I may be like, oh, I forgot, or I ignore it in some way. So in this manner, really, in a sense, we're trying to punish the other individual through our behavior. But we're not going to address the behavior specifically. Sarcastically, we may say, oh no, everything's fine, I'm just doing well, there's no issues here. But our behavior tells people otherwise. That's passive aggressiveness. So rather than tell them explicitly, our behavior gives it away, even though we may be telling them the exact opposite. The next one on your slide is directly aggressive. And this person is very explicit, so that's the positive thing. You're not going to wonder if this person is experiencing conflict. It's going to be evident. On the negative side of things, the aggressiveness is not always a positive thing. Even though we know where the individual stands, we know how they may feel, they tend to be pretty explicit. And that's why we throw that word aggressive in there, is that you can view this person, or this person often is, in attack mode. So oftentimes it can escalate the behavior, and we'll talk about that, escalate the conflict, and we'll talk about the significance of that in just a minute. The last one is assertive. And the assertive individual, all things being considered, all other things equal, is probably what we might at first glance say is the best behavior. And that is where the individual isn't aggressive, but they are very clear as far as how they view the situation. They are very clear about their opinion, their position, and the conflict that they're experiencing. But they're polite in saying it. They're just very direct, much more so. So typically, there's not any question about where this person stands. How this differs from the directly aggressive is that they are more respectful in delivering that. So then the next slide poses a question to you, and that is, which style is best to use? And the answer to that, it may seem like it's very simple, but it's kind of a trick question, because in the answer, there is no best style, generally. But there can be for the situation. And there are 3 general things, 3 things that you can consider in providing that answer. And that is the situation. So how dire is it? Is it an emergency? Is it not an emergency? Do we need an answer right now? Does this have to be resolved instantly, or do we have some time to work this out? The other person. So what is their personality? What is their nature? How significant is this issue to them? And then the last thing is your goals. So you're a part of this. What are your overall goals, and how does this particular conflict fit into it? So in deciding which style is best, you need to consider those 3 areas. So if we look at that, there are some specific behaviors that can reinforce that a conflict is going to be more productive or functional, as we say, versus counterproductive or dysfunctional. And those behaviors are listed for you on the next slide, which has that question mark of, is there such a thing as good conflict? And there are kind of opposing behaviors here. So I'm going to list the 7 positive and discuss the negative or the dysfunctional behaviors in light of those. So the first one is integration. So what this is encouraging you to do is that when you're in conflict, is that your behavior, your language, your communication reinforces integration rather than polarization. So basically, it works to keep the we in the situation rather than creating, which we often do, that us versus them. The next one fits into that well, and that is cooperation versus opposition. So that we come to the table, or we come to the discussion in conflict with a cooperative attitude. So we show respect, our language reinforces cooperation rather than opposition. Again, kind of the we versus, as opposed to us versus them, or I versus you. The next one is confirmation versus disconfirmation. This is a really powerful tool. I think it's probably one of the most powerful, and that is to show other people value and respect. All of us like to feel like others value us and others respect us. And if we don't, if we disconfirm others, or if we feel disconfirmed, it's much more likely to make the situation worse and counterproductive. So it's important to keep in mind when you're engaging in conflict and working to manage it or resolve it, to confirm other people, to show them value, to show them respect, as well as the issues at hand. The next one is agreement versus coercion. And what this is working toward is long-term especially, is individuals are much more likely to work with us productively if they are allowed to come into agreement. If we reach agreement with someone else, or are we forced into that answer? Often when we're forced into that answer, there can be damage, not only to the issue at hand, but also with the relationship in the long term as well as future conflicts. So it's important to work toward agreement and have buy-in, in a sense. Which fits nicely with the next one, and that is de-escalation and escalation. As you may have learned so far, or discussed at some point, is all relationships are dynamic. And basically, what that means is that relationships are either getting better or they're getting worse. They're always changing. And if we use language that escalates the situation in relation to a conflict, or de-escalates the situation in relation to a conflict, that conflict is much more likely to get worse or better dependent on that. So if the same way that we look at it in terms of our relationships are always getting better or worse, your communication is always making a situation or a conflict better or worse. So the language we use, our response, can either de-escalate or escalate the conflict. So it's important to think how we respond to others, the language we use, our nonverbal communication with them, how we address things, how we come across, because that's either going to escalate, make the conflict harder to deal with, harder to manage, harder to resolve, or make it easier to deal with, because we're de-escalating the situation, we're making it better. The next variable is foresight versus short-sightedness. And what this encourages individuals to do is don't just focus on the issue at hand. Don't just focus on this conflict, but also look at how we manage this conflict, how we deal with it, and what that is going to do in the long term. So short-sightedness, the here and now, versus foresight, what's out there in the future. And the more that we think about the future in resolving this particular conflict right now, the more positive that conflict is going to be. It may feel really good at the moment just to let loose on something, but we got to think about what will that mean for the future. I may be able to push something through right now, but does that mean that somebody's going to want to push something through back on me in the future? So we should think about that, and it's much more likely to be productive. The last thing listed is positive versus negative results. And obviously, that's what good conflict is. What allows for good conflict is positive results. And if we look at those behaviors that are there before, the more that we can reinforce those, the more that I do, the more that you do, the more likely that conflict is going to be a positive thing. Because it's going to, if we look at how I said before, relationships are dynamic, it's going to allow for positive growth. It's going to create more understanding. It's going to help us identify our goals and provide for clarity. And then the more that those behaviors on the right there on your slide are followed, the more likely it's going to be dysfunctional and lead to negative results. So in today's key concept lecture, we covered 3 things. We looked at conflict styles, which style is best to use, and what you need to consider in answering that question, and functional versus dysfunctional conflict. So what we have learned is that positive conflict is not a contradiction.